Hello, and welcome to the How I Tested That podcast. I'm your host, David J. Bland. I'm an author and advisor, and I'm fascinated with testing early stage ideas. I've helped companies all around the world, and in this podcast, I connect with entrepreneurs and innovators who had the courage to test their ideas with real people in the market, with sometimes surprising results. Please join us as we explore the ups and downs of experimentation together. In this episode, we interview Pat Copeland and get a first-hand account of how the dash button idea was originally tested at Amazon. Everything from how the idea emerged from Bezos' famous morning puttering time to the cognitive load customers experienced pushing a button to order a box of sweets, and eventually to products like detergent. Even though the product was discontinued, the learning they captured along the way influenced other Amazon initiatives such as Alexa, smart subscriptions, and auto-stocking appliances. Pat shares his perspective on entrepreneurial thinking and building a culture of experimentation from Amazon, but also from his time in leadership roles at companies like Autodesk, Microsoft, Google, and Zendesk. We wrapped up our conversation with the challenges of scaling ideas and the future of machine learning in commerce with his latest endeavor, Moloco. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Pat.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, David.
I am so excited. Of all my guests I've had so far, I don't know if I've been this excited to have somebody on because you have such an extensive experience in testing and innovation and leading companies through that I am just excited to pick your brain and have you share some stories with us of what went well and what didn't go well. If you could just give a little bit of our listeners a background who don't know about you, of sort of just a little snippet of your career and what you're up to at the present time.
First thing, thank you for having me. I'm flattered. And I think of myself as kind of an entrepreneurial thinker that tries to do projects that have a high beta associated with them. And I've kind of factored my career, even if I was working in large companies like Microsoft, where I started, or Google, or Amazon, trying to factor some of my energy towards things that hadn't been solved yet. So I'm not the kind of person that has been a database person their whole career, or somebody that is really interested in one narrow part of computer science. I've generally been broad and really focused on trying to figure out how to innovate and make things valuable to the customer, and spend a lot of energy thinking about iterating my way to better and better customer-focused products. And I think that would probably be the thing that I'm most focused on.
I think it's fascinating that you take this almost like customer first approach of let's focus on, I think you call these high beta. Maybe you can clarify for our listeners what you mean by high beta, because I don't know if they're all familiar with that framing.
I started my career running into the burning house and putting out the fire and being the person that could come into a project that was not really on track and fixing it, fixing the team, fixing the product strategy, making things work. And so I think that put me into a mindset of being okay with risky things to do. And a lot of times I was working on very successful companies that had basically like a battleship, and I'm on deck number 13 of the battleship. And my project is not going to make the battleship sink or succeed, but potentially if I'm really successful, it could be something that's notable. Given that safety net, I decided to kind of do things that were higher risk. And I would say what I mean by beta, I have taken on projects where it was okay to fail. And there was a lot of upside if there was success. And so many, many projects are kind of like this if you seek them out. And certain people like to do them and certain people really don't. I would say that my career had its ups and downs where I didn't really have a plan, but I kind of pursued larger and larger opportunities where I could take on interesting challenges that were technical or trying to solve for a customer problem. And I think that mindset drove me to things that were with higher risk. And then with higher risk, it required better focus on iteration and trying to build confidence or not build confidence based on testing the context of where you are to step forward and move forward with the better and better product idea. So that's what I mean by high beta, is just the high risk factor, projects that maybe aren't set up to succeed necessarily, where there's no safety net, and it requires an iterative thinking process, sometimes nonlinear, in order to get to that successful product.
I like that framing. I'm always fascinated by why people get into this line of work and then how they perceive risk and how they deal with large amounts of risk. And I have to say, for me, some personal challenges I have is I'm risk averse and I have a hard time dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And I feel as if it's like personal growth for me to be able to coach people through it using like a lightweight system, or a way of thinking. And it sounds as if initially in your career, you were able to navigate and maybe save some projects that were doomed to fail, or I'm sure we weren't able to save all of them, but really be able to course correct some things. I do a lot of work in Silicon Valley, and I've noticed when I go into big companies sometimes, they're like, well, we need entrepreneurial people, so we have to look outside the org and hire external people. I'm always hesitant at first. Usually my response is, well, why don't we look at some of the people that have been entrepreneurial inside your company, even though maybe that's not the title you gave them, but they were able to walk into situations like you walked into and use their creative thinking skills and manage risk to help things move forward. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, or what's your take on sort of external versus internal, and how do you look for people that are kind of like you?
I think it's a really good point. Entrepreneurial thinking exists everywhere. I actually wrote an article about this for IEEE with a guy named Alberto Savoia back at Google. And I forget exactly what the title of the article was, but it was something like entrepreneurial product thinking. And it asserted exactly what you talked about. And I think Google did a pretty good job of this, actually, of figuring out how to unlock everybody's potential to be an owner and think outside the box. And so there was this idea that anything was possible there, at least when I was there. It was the kind of company where there was kind of limitless opportunity. And we were in the position of the Brinks truck would back up to the building and we'd be, where do we stack all these gold bricks? We just don't have enough room for it. There was a lot of room for kind of doing side projects and innovation. And there was a lot of entrepreneurial thinking. There was actually a database that had hundreds of thousands of ideas that employees had. It just kind of shows you the wastefulness also of large organizations. The ability for a large organization to harness some of that stuff, I think it's a lossy conversion, partially because their eyeballs are so big. At the Google level, you would need to create $1 billion business for them to really care. And if you created a $10 million business, they don't even want to do anything. Externally, that might have been an incredible success. If you created a $100 million company, I mean, you are among the 0.01 percentile, of successful entrepreneurs. At Google, that would have been, they wouldn't have bent over to pick up that 100 million off the ground. I think that a lot of it is the context that you're in either encourages or discourages entrepreneurial success. And some of that is by the level of investment and the willingness for a company to try new things. And so I do agree with your premise that entrepreneurial thinking is everywhere and that you should look at people that are good at it in the context that you're in. Because a lot of times I think entrepreneurs, if you look at them in isolation, you say like, wow, they were really successful. But like, what was the context that made them successful? And somebody external, they had a lot of freedom, potentially. Obviously, they had investors that were telling them, kind of things to do and hustling them a little bit. But in general, like a CEO outside would have a tremendous amount of freedom to hire who they wanted, to run their process like they wanted. When you get into a company like Google, there's all kinds of infrastructure around you because of their scale that they require you to align with. And so I think some entrepreneurs will come into a place like Google and be like, why are you clipping my wings? Why are you doing this to me? I can't succeed in this nightmarish Byzantine situation. And to the people inside the company, you're like, what are you talking about? This is like paradise. I think that context is really important. And the type of risk taking is also very different. Like I was trying to say earlier about like the difference between the way that you would evaluate whether to invest or not invest. When I think about working at a big company, I think that how do I unlock the people that I have is my primary option. And trying to replicate somebody's ability to do entrepreneurial stuff in a different context, I think is a kind of a lossy conversion. There's potential there for sure. And some people have been serial entrepreneurs and they have a track record. And I think that that's one way that you look at this is like, who is good at getting things done within a particular context? And let's double down on those people and let's listen to them, because not only do they have experience being able to do entrepreneurial things, like you're pointing out, it's not just about the idea. I think entrepreneurialism is also a lot, maybe 99% execution. of that idea and working your way through whatever situation you're in. So I would say entrepreneurial people are ones where you can see that they've been successful, but the context is really important. And how did that context help them or hinder their ability to deliver that innovation is something that I would really look at.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, I wasn't aware that you wrote a paper with Alberto, so I'll have to look that up. I reached out to him to quote him in my book. I'm a fan of his work just in general, prototyping and everything. And so it doesn't surprise me, I guess, but I learned something from that answer. So I'm going to go check that out. And two, with regards to people, it was a big learning curve for me because my thing is, let's assemble sort of like a small cross-functional team around an idea and let's iterate to find out, is this something we should pivot, persevere, or sunset? Really adopting from like lean startup and my early involvement in that movement and design thinking and agile and all this stuff mashed together. What I learned was kind of insightful because I thought at first, well, of course, these people are going to stay with this idea and grow it and scale it if it's successful and we have traction. And what I realized instead was there were people who would opt out right before the scaling sort of inflection point and say, look, I don't want to scale this. That's not something I'm passionate about. Do you have any other ideas that I can work on? And so I think naively, I thought, well, we're going to have these stable cross-functional teams that are just going to scale with the idea. And instead, I ended up realizing that we have this kind of split from a personality perspective where some people, yeah, they would stay and they believed in the idea and they wanted to scale it. And others would just opt out and say, okay, what do you have next for me to test?
Absolutely. I personally call that trading breadth for depth. And, if you're successful, you're going to start to scale that business or that team a little bit. You're going to have larger administrative overhead. You're going to have more complexity because you're going to have to deal with more customers maybe, or more situations, more of these cross-functional issues that start to emerge as you scale. And you really have to decide, like, what do I care about? And I think that there are people who love the idea itself and are willing to stick with an idea. And some people really love the idea of going from 0 to 1 or 1 to 100. They're the growers. And I personally have made that trade-off many times where I've taken teams that were in the hundreds, hundreds of people team, and given them away completely in order to start from scratch on something that I believed in, that I thought was interesting to work on, maybe an area that I was curious about, and taking that risk of just doing something fresh. So I definitely feel like there have been times in my career where I've done exactly that thing of moving on once the thing kind of takes flight. There's other times where I stuck with it longer, but I can definitely understand the mindset of wanting to move on because there's definitely a dopamine and kind of an excitement around doing something new that is completely different than the refinement exercise of taking it to the next level. And it really does require like a dedication to different types of mindsets. People that operate teams for long periods of time, I really admire them in a lot of ways because it's something that I can't really do. I'm not really geared up to be, it sounds weird because I worked at places like Microsoft and Google for literally a decade each. But during that time, I felt like I went through 3 or 4 different companies, even within there. And I moved around quite a bit, seeking kind of like oxygen in a cave. You're kind of trapped in this cave system. And it's like, where do I find oxygen so I can continue to survive? There are periods of time where you'll consume all of the air in one area. And you literally need to go to some other place in order to refresh yourself. And being willing to do that is like this risk-taking thing that maybe it's slightly dysfunction, but you kind of need it in order to feel like that you're making progress. I think it does really require different types of mentality. And I've done both, so I can understand both. I don't know if there's a DNA that is like entrepreneurial because you can switch it to last longer in a job. It's like have patience. But there is an impatience that exists among most entrepreneurs or innovators that is a little different. You can see it in the way that they're kind of always pushing and kind of trying to drive their idea further. The grind of an innovator is slightly different than the mentality of an operator or a maintainer.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Shifting gears a little bit here, how we got connected was on LinkedIn. For those of you that don't think LinkedIn is valuable, I think this is maybe a counterpoint to it. I wrote an article on the Amazon Dash button, and I wrote this article a few years ago. And I was just fascinated by the overall idea of testing something that small at Amazon. It was different. It was away from screen purchasing, all of that. and you commented on it. And I almost missed your comment because the downside of LinkedIn is I don't get updates on comments, or I get hundreds of comments on something and everything gets lost. And I just happened to go back and check that post. And I was like, who is this guy? And then I realized you actually worked on the early stage Dash at Amazon. And so that was my initial reason to reach out. And then I found out so much more about you. So I'm just thrilled to have you here. But maybe we can dive into that a little bit, whatever you can share, of where did that idea come from? How were you involved with it? Maybe some of the tests. I'm just happy to dive into that a bit if you're willing to share with our audience.
Absolutely. Thanks for reaching out too. Like, I'm glad that we serendipitously met that way. Amazon is actually a really interesting kind of entrepreneurial environment. And they really encourage this. They encourage all employees to write up new ideas. And it's a very document-centric culture where you kind of write down your ideas and then those go through a filtration process and you kind of manage up and you end up kind of arguing for a thing to do. And, they call it a PRFAQ. It's a way of, when you think of a press release, you start off one of these press releases like, the New York Times today said that Prime Surprise Sweets was launched. And you kind of write it from a future perspective. And so you're in the position of writing it retrospectively after the thing was successful. And it kind of puts you in that mentality of like, well, why was it successful? What did we do? Like, who were our customers? What did our customers do when they got this product? Like, why did it make an impact? And then the FAQ part is where you ask yourself a bunch of Socratic questions that poke at yourself. Like, what are you going to do about chocolates that melt in the mail? Or what are you going to do about always surprising people with this product? And then you try to answer those. And so that's kind of how Amazon's innovation machine works. And it really works for them, but you kind of have to take their whole process in your arms if you want to work there. I mean, it really is a process of getting innovation to go. But once it's committed to, Amazon will grind its way through and support you with resources and like incredible internal technology. So I felt like it was one of these places where if you could work that machine of Amazon to do these things, it was amazing. So the way that Prime Surprise Sweets came around, which is not only the dash button, but the very first dash button. And so the dash button was a thing that AWS came up with, which was like an Internet of Things device where you could push it and it would just execute a Lambda function in the cloud. So you could basically make it do whatever you wanted. And so I bought one when it first came out, and I wasn't even working at Amazon at the time. And I just had it send me an email when I pushed it. And it was funny because I was like rummaging through a drawer the other day, and I pushed it, and it sent me an email 6 years later. It was like a ghost. They basically work by connecting to your Wi-Fi, and they send some event, and Amazon picks up that event over the internet, makes a Lambda call, and then does whatever you told it to do in the cloud. So it's a cool thing. Now, the question is, what do you do with that button? What is it good for? Like, why did we create this thing? And so they were kind of struggling in AWS with an application. Could it be a doorbell? Could you take a picture in a camera type situation in a store? What would this button do? So Bezos came up with this idea. Jeff Bezos, obviously, CEO of Amazon for people that live in a cave. He is very entrepreneurial and risk taker himself. And so one of the things that he likes to do is he calls it like putzing around in the morning. And so he just kind of like has time in his morning where he wakes up and he just kind of takes his shower or whatever, has breakfast, and just does whatever he wants to do. During that time, apparently, he came up with this idea of, hey, let's come up with some kind of cool consumer-based product that when I click the dash button, you could get a box of treats from it. And so the idea would be you would buy this thing for $4.99. It was like a $5 thing. And we would give you the dash button. And when you pressed it, it would place an order for these boutique sweets. And why would they be boutique sweets? Well, we could send you a candy bar, but that would be kind of lame. So could we think of something that would be a lot more exciting? And it would be like a surprise box of like really nice boutique treats. So that was the idea. And so he kind of handed that idea to our team. And then we were responsible for developing that into, well, what would it really be? You look at these things if they come down from top down and you kind of interpret them. You look at them and you say like, well, would this really work? I mean, Bezos, this is like maybe a 3-hour thought that he had. And like, are we going to spend our lives like building this thing? And this team is dedicating their careers to make this happen. It's like, do we really believe in it? And how would we make it work? So there is a level of innovation there. Even though the idea is interesting, it was like, how would you implement it? What would the operations look like? Where would you source these treats from? How would you send them to the customer? How often would you accept the dash button being clicked? Could we turn this into a thing where you could buy it for grandma and then you would pay for grandma getting treats every month? Or could you get it as a gift? These were the types of things that we had to work through. And so it really became kind of, where could we take this idea further? And given the kind of the starting point, it gave us kind of a blank slate of being able to do a lot of different ideas. And there were no other dash buttons in progress. And so we were also kind of pioneering the idea of, what do we do with these dash buttons? And can we further the idea of what dash buttons are for? That was why it started.
Oh, I could listen to this all day. So a couple of things. One, I'm learning from your stories anyway. I do all my research and everything, but I'm literally talking to somebody who's been there. So in my work, and some of my work's used at Amazon paired with this sort of press release working backwards format, which is what I learned from D school, which was like desirable, viable, feasible as far as risk goes. And it almost sounds like, yeah, it was feasible as far as we think we can have a button. Granted, you have to work out the operations and obviously limit people just pressing it all the time and all that. But it was more of a desirability risk with who and what's the value prop to them and what would they use it for and the gains they would get from it. And then maybe even a little bit of viability risk, which we haven't touched on yet, which is the cost incurred. You mentioned a price point for getting the button out to them and everything. It almost feels like so many of these ideas that I hear at other companies kind of go to die when they trickle down because the team really have a hard time framing that risk and working their way through it. And I don't know if that's exact framing you used, but it sounds like you were thinking through the right kinds of questions to ask as far as how would we implement this in a small way to get some traction.
Yeah. The other thing to think about is why we would do such a project. Because, we were talking about before of this is going to be a rounding error in the grand scheme of things. I mean, compared to Nike shoes or something, like this type of a project is going to make pennies. And why would Amazon do it? Well, the idea was, could we test the habitual behavior of a button being pushed by a consumer? And could we also test the idea of closing the loop with that button being something that causes an order to be processed and a transaction to be done? Bezos's idea was, okay, as a first step, could we create a project where the end value that's produced by the consumer is such a cool thing that there's no friction in wanting that thing? Like take away the friction of like, everybody likes treats, right? Everybody likes cookies or whatever. So there's no friction in like figuring out what category is of interest to people. And there's no worry about the desire. So the desire of the consumer was hypothetically there. The thing that we were trying to validate was, would people push the button a second, a third, a fourth time? And with that habitual behavior, like why would you think about pressing the button? Let's say several weeks have gone by and it's like, hey, I want some treats. Would you run to the button and push it, or would you go to the store instead? The idea was, if you could prove that, then you might be able to do other things with the button, like, for example, replenishment of a consumable like detergent or something, or buy paper towels. So those were the ideas. It's like this was a precursor idea to try to gauge customer intent to purchase, not only intent, but actual purchase. And like, if you're a fan of Alberto, one of his good quotes is like, people are more than willing to open their mouths, but they're not very willing to open their wallets. That's absolutely true in innovation. So like when you do these surveys of consumers and you're trying to build a product and you go and you talk to people, and even if you go to talk to big enterprises and customers, they'll say, yes, I'm very interested in whatever you're doing. And yeah, we would be really curious to participate in it. And then it's like, okay, well, this is how much the investment is going to be. Oh, yeah, we're not that interested. And so the idea was, could you really test the consumer full cycle of purchase and have skin in the game where they would do this? And so the idea was there. It was really interesting. And we weren't expecting it to be a commercial success in a sense. Like what we were doing is trying to solve a concept, a hypothesis that customers would use these buttons to buy things that they were interested in. And then from there, maybe we could inspire other teams to do other things. And I also think if I give the project some credit and go beyond what it was, I mean, it was like a treat box. It led to some things like, if you think about how Alexa does prompting for reordering or how that happens on the site, I think some of those suggestions and those nudges, they figured out how to make them a lot more effective. And the button kind of requires you to make, and this is something they talk a lot about Amazon, is how do you decrease the cognitive load of a problem? Okay, so cognitive load meaning, okay, I need to do some task. And the cognitive load, if I have to think about, am I going to be home when that delivery is made? And where's my credit card? And I have to put that credit card in again. And I have to go through and do this form to put in my address every time that I order something. So Amazon is like, okay, let's just make it friction free, and let's reduce all cognitive load to the smallest thing possible. So that is something that they really focus on. If you notice on Amazon, like the ordering process is just very friction free. You can pretty much click a button and buy something now. That was the concept. So how do we reduce cognitive load of intent to purchase to I received a box 2 days later? It's an interesting concept. And I think that they've continued to evolve and think about how to do that in a much better ways than using a dash button. But circling back to the dash button, the cognitive load of, okay, I want a treat, to where is that dash button? Where did I put it? To I'm going to click it. And then thinking like, did it actually order something? I'm not sure. What did that button just do? I don't know. I pressed it and maybe some magic is happening somewhere, but I don't really know. Like that cognitive load was too high in general. And so like the product was kind of set up in a way that was never going to be successful. And I think that was one of the primary discoveries, is the habitual usage wasn't there. And I could get into like other things, like the operational problems that existed were tremendous as well. Like there were melted chocolate. And you think like everybody loves treats. Everybody would love a box like this. There would be no problem with people getting a prime surprise sweets in their mailbox. But you think about like, do you like coconut? Do you like coffee flavored chocolate? Do you have a nut allergy? Are you gluten free? Do you have a peanut butter aversion? So all of a sudden, like this world of like, oh, everybody loves sweets too. No, that's not true. Everybody loves some kind of sweet. That diversity, like you start to have to narrow down stuff that's going to work for everybody. And that becomes a very, very small subset of stuff that you can send through the mail that will not be destroyed through the mail and will be generally loved by people. So that was the other side of it. The target of it was difficult to be successful with a broad enough audience. So we ended up kind of having like a very niche, peculiar group that loved the program. I mean, they would like blog post about it and they would have unboxing ceremonies and all this stuff, but it didn't really have mass appeal because of the cognitive load on the one hand, and secondly, the logistics issues of being able to fill a box with things that a broad population would appreciate.
That resonates with me. There's so much amazing things to unpack there. So with the sweet thing, I wouldn't have guessed either until I was at a startup weekend. I think we were at somewhere in Silicon Valley. And Goggin, he was like helping Udemy and now he's doing Maven, but he had this food kind of startup in the Bay Area called Sprig. And they offered this little treat, like a truffle, as an extra thing. And they did it for free. They were just an extra thing. And the backlash they got from it, from their customers, was just unprecedented. Like they couldn't have predicted how many people were complaining about this extra treat. Did I pay for this treat? I didn't want this treat. I'm gluten-free, like all these different things. And so when you were talking about that, I remember talking to him and he was so surprised too of it looked like a quick win, something obviously people would want. And then you get down into the details and it's not as simple. But the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking, it feels as if, and maybe you can help me understand this, you're really, in a way, we're testing away from screen purchases. And although that button does have a cult following, to this day, I see people writing ways to hack that button and still have it do stuff in different ways. But in a way, it almost feels like even though it didn't have a monetary impact as its own thing, you influenced like Alexa's strategy and so many other things inside Amazon just by proving this out with evidence and just kind of being iterative about it.
I think that that's definitely true. And I think that that's why Amazon's model works, is that you create these artifacts and these case studies, in a sense, that have sometimes beginnings and ends. And then other teams will riff off of that. So once Prime Surprise Suites kind of had its ups and downs, like other teams looked at that and said like, oh, well, we're going to create branded buttons. And so one of the focuses was on all of these consumer focused brands, like Tide had a button and Bounty had a button. And then you would have like a series of buttons that you would stick on your wall next to your dryer, maybe in your utility room, and you would press it when you need it. But again, the problem with that out of screen, out of device purchasing was the cognitive load of like knowing that when I run out of paper towels, I go to the button and not to what I've been habitualized to do, which is go to my device, which is what's the barrier to entry between those two? It's like getting up and walking to another room and clicking a button seems really simple, but like the device in my hand is like so much more powerful than that button. And I know it gives me affirmation after I press it that something happened. There is like a cognitive load gap there that is somewhat uncrossable, that with Alexa, I think that it offers me suggestions for things that I need to replenish. Then I have to actively engage and say, yes, I want that thing. So maybe if there was a return value on the device, it would have been slightly different, but it's hard to say. I don't know if that off-screen button, I would just say, like, I would do my own editorial and say, I don't know if that was successful in any of the contexts that Amazon tried. But, you never know. You never know. I mean, there may be another way of doing it in the future that does something that is instantaneous and has high value and is measurable. And people love reinforcement. They love to see that a task was completed. And when it's kind of that open-ended, I'm not sure, like, did the batteries run out already? Or did it actually place the order? Or when's the order coming? Or what did I pay for that order? Did Bounty change its pricing? And when's it going to come? All of that stuff was a question mark with the button that the device was able to do. So maybe there's an application that would be killer for it, but we were unable to come up with it. But I guess my point is other teams did riff off of it. Other teams did look for off-screen applications to shopping. I think that some of them have been more successful than others, especially things like replenishment, I think have been really, really good on Alexa, where if they can give a very, very targeted suggestion, ones that I've been getting lately are things like, hey, you need to replenish this, or some price drop has occurred for something that you were interested in. Do you want to buy that? Those are interesting nudges that sometimes I'm willing to take. But yeah, it's interesting. I think that customers have a very, very keen interest in getting feedback. And like, I think shopping is also kind of a dopamine producer. It's like we're genetically predisposed to go and forage for things. And when you make a discovery, it's like you feel good about yourself. You did something positive, you made progress on something. And the dash button was like halfway to that, but it wasn't a full closure.
Yeah, I could see that. And I can't say enough about the impact of something like this, even if it's not from a viability point of view, you move the needle in some meaningful way with that specific initiative, just the ripple effects of how it impacts other teams. And I think that's why we want to socialize this kind of work inside companies. Quite often, I'm liking a lot of our work to almost like scientific method, where we have a hypothesis, we're going to go test that. But I think socializing what has happened, the wins and the failures. And then so many teams I coach, that first thing might not be successful, but if they learn this way of working, they're going to apply it to something that is going to be a big success eventually. I often take that approach too of I'm playing the long game here of I'm really investing in people and their critical thinking skills and how they iterate through things. And I'm finding that if leaders can create a culture of experimentation or an environment where that can occur, then that's really special. Sometimes our iteration, and I wrote a LinkedIn rant about this a few weeks ago, it feels like the thinking's removed from the iteration and the iteration's just about delivery. But I think your story here really emphasizes that, no, we need the critical thinking skills, especially in these high uncertainty, high beta initiatives.
I totally agree. And I mean, thanks for bringing that back to the team, because speaking of the team, how would I describe them? I actually described the guy who led this project on my team. I don't know if I should name him or not, but Dirk, I called him a swashbuckling pirate in his review. And that's how I kind of envisioned him. Is he's the kind of guy who is willing to take on Mission Impossible and to try and iterate at all costs. And he went on to do other things after this project, and so did a lot of the team. We actually repurposed this team to do another entrepreneurial project around doing unsolicited samples. The key being unsolicited. So like a lot of times you get a sample at a store, you actually pursue that sample. Like you know that sample is being provided to you and you go and you elect in. Well, could we be proactive with those at Amazon and say like, hey, based on your shopping, we think that you would like this. And so we actually created a whole program and we sent out millions and millions of samples, things like shampoos and toothpaste and all kinds of things. And now he works at Nike and he's also working on a bunch of entrepreneurial programs there. So the idea being that I think that if you create that environment and you allow people to explore that they will continue, and maybe it's a selection bias, but they'll go on to do multiple other things that will be interesting for either the company or industry. And so I completely agree with your point.
Yeah, I've had that with some of the people I've coached where they've either left to join startups or other companies, and they bring that thinking along with them and try to help create that culture wherever they are. I could talk Amazon Dash Button all day, but you've done other things too. And what are you up to now? I mean, that was a little while ago. What are you doing this year? What gets you excited? Like, what are maybe some things you're trying to test, maybe even your career or what you're up to now, if you could share them with us?
Yeah, for sure. Well, let me go back 30 years and just say I got my master's degree at USC in machine learning. I was a pre-med. I had a conversation with my dad around this, and he said, I'm really disappointed that you don't want to be a doctor. He was a doctor, and he said, I'm worried about you making money in computer science, and you need to be able to support yourself. And the fact that I was really focused on machine learning, I think concerned him quite a bit. That sounds absurd today, but so many things have happened in order to make machine learning very, very valuable and important these days that maybe I don't blame him too much, in hindsight. But we had the original ideas around how to make machines make interesting decisions based on neural networks 30 years ago, but it did take massive breakthroughs in distributed computing and processing power and GPUs and hardware in order to get us to today. So I'm really happy that over my career, I've been able to kind of dive in and do machine learning projects where it had application and interest. And to be blunt, I think that in the future, I don't think that there is an app that won't have some kind of reasoning or machine learning as one of its core values that it brings, whether it's TikTok with good recommendations or Amazon with its shopping recommendations. I just think machine learning is going to be required in order to survive in any kind of relationship with consumers in the future. So I'm super excited about that. And I just joined a company called Moloco that is a company that's building a lot of the advertising products that I built at Amazon. And so what we're doing is we're taking those concepts of things that only very large companies have been able to invest in, where they have data scientists and applied scientists and lots of access to resources to train these models. And we've been giving them to everybody other than Amazon and Walmart. So could one of our company partners, our really great partners, is Wayfair. And how do we help them be able to do some of these connections with customers and be able to have highly relevant experiences using machine learning? And so we are a machine learning company that applies specialized models that are trained to companies like Wayfair in order to create that same relevancy that requires a tremendous amount of investment. And it's a green field because you look at it and most companies don't know how to do the depth of applied science and machine learning that we have. It's really kind of still a specialized skill, just like it was back 30 years ago. But now it's more about how to apply it to an application. And so it's a really interesting time. It's not just about the science, but we're actually working on a three-way win between the commerce site, so somebody like Wayfair, the advertisers who are trying to reach the customers, and the shoppers themselves, like having very highly relevant experiences. So that three-way win is something that we built at Amazon, and I'm replicating that again for everybody else. And in doing so, what we're doing is we're enabling commerce, which has very thin margins, to be able to be successful and to create competition so that commerce can thrive. Why is only Amazon dominant in retail online? Is that fair? Or Walmart? Can we create more companies that can survive, thrive, and be able to have great relationships with their customers across the board using the same technology? And the answer is absolutely yes. So it's an exciting time because people are realizing how valuable this tech is, and we're able to apply it now in new ways. That's what's getting me super excited right now.
Yeah, I can see why. So much of it's timing. I think about startups I joined in the dot-com era, and we just quite frankly didn't have the infrastructure to pull off some of the things we were trying to do, or customer behavior wasn't there. The idea of Airbnb and Uber and Lyft, I mean, back then, late 90s, that would have been scary for people. But that's fascinating that you're taking everything you've learned. I guess whatever you're comfortable sharing, is there like one big assumption that you're looking to test this year, or something that keeps you up at night with all of this? Do you feel like I need some evidence around this part of what I'm doing?
I would say, how do we scale a solution like this where we perfected it within Amazon in a vertical situation? And one of the inside baseball things I'll say is that there was a lot of conflict in Amazon between the teams that were working on organic search, meaning when you type in a query and it uses NLP to match keywords to products. That team felt like they were defending the customer, and they were very much in charge of like creating a really good customer experience. And for many, many years, decades, their job was to take those magical words and map them to some catalog that had a product in it and to give the user what they wanted. So we call that spear phishing. You're giving the customer what they want. And like me, I like to really quickly get what I want and get out of a store generally. I'm not like somebody that hangs around. That spear phishing creates efficient shopping. It's really important. And then when you come in with these machine learning techniques, and especially when you're looking at introducing advertisers, why is advertising interesting, and why would it create relevance with the shopper? Well, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, advertiser, you know who buys your products. You know who buys your products better than we do because you're built your product for those customers. So how do we unlock that insight in a way that helps create higher relevancy in that same page? And so no longer is it just about NLP and about keyword matching and the customers giving us their intent. It's also about trying to match the right brand and the right advertiser to that customer. And if you do that well, you just unlock this incredible flywheel effect. And so the question is, as other companies, as we democratize this ability to go do this, they're all on their own kind of maturity curve in terms of how they think about that problem and how they approach it. And there's a distribution. Some are learning how to do that for the first time, and some are like very far along and are thinking about how to do it. And how do we introduce it in a way where we have limited resources, on our end, but how do we do it in a way where we can scale and help as many customers as we can without getting caught in everybody is a snowflake, and creating a generic platform that requires some tailoring, but doesn't require us to be all hands on deck with every single customer. So I think scaling is a really big thing that we need to work on. The technology can scale, but it's more about helping the customers through their life cycle and adopt this technology. That's really where the scaling gets challenged. It's how do you apply it within a specific context? I'm thinking about that quite a bit right now.
Yeah, I can see why. I personally have similar experiences at startups where we couldn't scale if we customized every single thing on our platform, and we had to have a common platform. There's some growing pains with that of what are the commonalities and will they have accept trade-offs and all that. But it sounds super exciting. It's almost like the future of targeted advertising in a way for companies beyond Walmart and Amazon. So that's super interesting. I wasn't aware that's what you're working on. So thank you for sharing that. I do want to be mindful over time too, because I could chat with you easily for another hour. So maybe if you're up for it, we could have you back in the future. But today, we covered everything from USC from 30 years ago in machine learning to your time at Amazon working on this dash button, which thank you so much for providing insights there. It was fascinating to me and our listeners. If somebody is just interested in what you're up to, or they need your help as far as targeting with advertising and everything, how would they reach out to you? What's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
I think probably the best way is like we were talking about, we connected on LinkedIn. I mean, I would be more than happy to hear from a new set of customers or somebody that's thinking about this area, or maybe even people that are interested in joining Moloco, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there and I'll respond. So thanks for that invitation to solicit interest.
Yeah, so what we'll do on the detail page is we'll also have links to Moloco and to Pat's LinkedIn profile. So you all can click there and get through too. I'm so excited. Thank you so much for hanging out with me again. I think we easily could do another episode about other things you've tested over the years. But just thanks for being so open and honest with us and sharing your thoughts with us today.
And David, thank you. And I really appreciate, we met serendipitously, but I really appreciated this conversation. And I really appreciate you diving deep and your interest in, entrepreneurial thinking and how to test them. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of How I Tested That, where we share stories about experimentation, tips, and tricks. If you learned something new, please recommend us to a friend or colleague. And remember, keep testing your ideas.